Hey guys, welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, welcome, I'm Georgia. On my platforms here on the internet, my YouTube page, my podcast, I like to do long form video essay style content, focusing mostly on true crime, bringing awareness to unsolved true crime, and history, which is what today's episode is going to be about. I like to teach you guys about those moments in history that you probably don't learn about in school, people that you don't learn about, these tiny moments, these tiny snippets of history that have actually had a massive, massive impact on our lives today, or alternatively had a massive impact on the people who were involved at the time. And today we're going to be talking about something called the Aversion Project. And this episode is going to get pretty rough. It's a horrible, horrible topic to talk about, but I think it's important to share these stories. So I've warned you, it is going to get rough. The Aversion Project, for the most part, was something that was kept under wraps for a very long time, but over the last couple of decades, drips of information about it have come out. Although we still don't really have a fully clear idea of what truly happened, we know enough to piece things together. The news around this first broke around mid-2000, and since then, we've been learning a little bit more as time's gone on. Now, just to warn you guys before we really get into the crux of this one, that this episode is going to include a lot of my personal thoughts, my personal opinions. I am a gay woman, I'm not going to apologise for that. This episode, this topic is clearly something that I feel very passionate about, and it's something that makes me quite emotional. I know a lot of people tend to think of me as just a narrator in these videos, a talking head, but this is my channel, these are my platforms, and I do have my own thoughts and feelings. So if my sort of personal opinions around this are going to upset you, if the fact that I am a gay woman is going to upset you, then maybe click off this video. Or actually no, don't click off this video, because I think this is a very important topic to learn about, particularly for people who maybe don't understand homosexuality. In what always seems to be a shock to some people, I'm not just a neutral, opinionless narrator. This is my platform. I do have my own thoughts and feelings I want to share, particularly on subjects like this. So throughout the Aversion Project, hundreds of gay people, maybe even thousands of gay people, were subject to electric shock therapy, hormone treatment, and chemical castration in an attempt to cure homosexuality that went many steps further than your typical conversion therapy. And when all of that failed, they would be forced through a sex change operation. Seriously, this was human rights abuse at its worst. And we're going to need to start with some context around both South African military and homosexuality in South Africa at this point in history, during apartheid. The South African Defence Force, the SADF, comprised the armed forces of South Africa from 1957 through to 1994, so through the bulk of apartheid. And apartheid ran from 1948 to 1994. It was the institutionalised racial segregation under the all-white government of South Africa, which dictated that non-white South Africans, which was the vast majority of the population, were required to live in separate areas from the whites, use separate public facilities, and contact between the two groups, white people and black people, was very much restricted. These race laws touched every aspect of life. One day I will do a full video on apartheid, but it's just, again, one of those subjects. It just feels too vast to even begin to touch in a video like this. The SADF was organised in the 50s to conduct a dual mission. One, to stop possible insurgency, to stop rebellion against apartheid, and two, to defend the Republic's borders. The military was mostly white South Africans, and in June 1967, the Defence Amendment Bill came into place, making military service compulsory for young white men. Conscription was put in place. All white males between the ages of 17 and 65 years old had to perform 9 months of service in either the SADF or the South African Police. In 1972, this 9 months was increased to 1 year, and then in 1977, this was 2 years and 30 days annually for 8 years. As resistance to apartheid increased in South Africa, so did the militarisation of the country. Conscription of white women was discussed over the decades, but it was never really put into effect. However, by 1989, 5.5% of the permanent force consisted of white women who signed up of their own accords. But all of this isn't to say that there weren't black South Africans in the force. They were the second largest group in the permanent force, and they were also allowed to serve as volunteers. Now, obviously, within conscription, in the forced participation in the military, there were members of the LGBTQ+ community, or homosexuals as they would have been referred to at the time, before the acronym was the norm. Permanent members of the military were prohibited from being homosexual, but it was allowed for conscripts. However, that's not to say the military liked it. They believed that banning homosexual men, who were already viewed as being morally corrupt, would just give that group a convenient way to avoid serving in the military. They knew that people didn't particularly want to serve, so inadvertently, doing it was a punishment. And the military also believed that homosexuality was a security risk. And this sort of makes me think back to the Lavender Scare in the USA. The Lavender Scare was basically this mass culling of gay men, queer men from the USA government in the 1950s that kind of ran alongside the Red Scare. In the same way that I said before that gay men were viewed as being morally corrupt in South Africa at this time, the same was thought in the USA. Gay men, morally corrupt. They couldn't be trusted to be in the USA government. They were more likely, apparently, to sympathise with communism. So they simply couldn't have gay men in the government because that was a security risk for everyone. Very much the same thing was believed in the SADF at this time. Under the ruling National Party in South Africa at this time, homosexuality was a crime punishable by up to 7 years in prison, so most gay men wouldn't exactly be out anyway. Or one of the capital offences for which you could be executed in the army by court-martial was homosexuality, so do not mistake them allowing gay men to join as tolerance. It was not tolerant. In general, the reports show a very confused treatment of gays by the SADF. There were said to be lesbian women in high-ranking positions. Many gay men found themselves to be in sort of de facto gay battalions, just being all grouped together. According to a man called Mickey Van Zyl, speaking to The Guardian, who was a researcher on the Aversion Project report, he said, in Uppington, virtually the whole battalion was queer, until some general decided this should be broken up. There was another one in Grahamstown, there was another in Pretoria. For some of them, these were very supportive environments. Until they weren't. I think your treatment within the military this time very much depended on the time you were conscripted, the higher ups that were dealing with you, the area you were in. It was very much a a case by case basis. But it certainly seems like over time it got a lot stricter, and eventually it came to be that conscripts were screened for homosexuality by doctors. I don't know what this screening consisted of, but those deemed to be homosexual were sent to a place called Ward 22. And there seems to be conflicting accounts as to just how hard the army looked for homosexuality at this time. But I do suspect that just for the sheer fact of the Aversion Project, they did start to hunt them out a little bit harder. At this point in the mid to late 20th century, gender ideologies, gender roles played a huge part in society. I mean, they still do now, but the nuclear family was what was expected. Your role in society was incredibly rooted in what was expected of femininity and masculinity. And that's not to say that's not still the case now, but people now are fighting back more. I mean, what is femininity really? What is masculinity? Life is more fun when you live somewhere in the grey. But that's not this video. Homosexuality in men is linked very closely with femininity. Masculine men are terrified of femininity, and that's always kind of the core of the issue, a hatred of women and femininity. When you're a man, being feminine is considered to be one of the worst things you can be. And so here you find yourself in a situation where these masculine men are in the military, which really is this sort of pit of masculinity, men, testosterone everywhere. And thrown into the mix are homosexual men, of whom straight men are afraid, for lack of a better word. Homosexuality poses a threat to masculine, heterosexist ideology. But as I was saying, back at this time in Western countries, homosexuality was not very well understood. It was thought that it was due to a lack of moral character. Some thought it was catching or was caused by something. It was thought of as a disease, a sin, a crime. And don't get me wrong, this is still very much a train of thought lots of people in the world have, but luckily it's getting lesser. There's a research paper about the Aversion project subtitled Psychiatric Abuses in the SADF During the Apartheid Era. I'll leave it linked down below, but a quote from that reads, "The attitude was simplistic, crude and stereotypical to an extreme. Male homosexuals were perceived as effeminate and passive, inadequate males who wanted to be female. Female homosexuals were the reverse, butch women who aspired to be male." And there was also a fascinating quote by Curtis and Taken in 1996, which I want to share as well. That says, even though the definitions of homosexuality generally refer to both men and women, they're usually based on work with men unless otherwise specified. From the outset, lesbianism has caused problems in the categorizations and studies, exposing its patriarchal origins. I mean, there's a lot of information out there about homosexuality throughout history, but it usually always refers to males. Lesbianism has pretty much been ignored in the history books, and that again is a whole other video. And homosexuality was pretty prominent in the psychiatric, psychological and medical discourses of this time as well. I mean, it was literally in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It was under sort of sexual deviation, although it was eventually removed in 1973. Homosexuality was thought of as a disease, and that meant people thought it could be cured. A mindset people still do have today. I mean, you just look at conversion camps. Conversion camps are very much still a thing. People think that it can be cured. It can't. There is no evidence that any form of therapy, conversion, or drug works to make people straight. Sexual orientation cannot be shifted through something like therapy. But that's where Dr. Aubrey Levin comes in, a South African-born psychiatrist and former colonel in the SADF. He'd started his medical studies at the University of Pretoria in 1954, but wouldn't qualify as a psychiatrist until 1969. Just 1 year before he qualified, he'd submitted a letter to the secretary. Just 1 year beforehand, so in 1968, Levin submitted a letter to the Secretary of the South African Parliament in Cape Town. He was requesting that he could present his work to the Select Committee for the Immorality Amendment Act, in which he used electric shocks as treatment for homosexuals and lesbians. This was his suggestion for a cure to homosexuality. And he became so well known for this that his colleagues gave him the nickname Dr. Shock. His proposed treatment for curing homosexuality included using electroshock therapy, showing patients pornographic images of same-sex people whilst at the same time shocking them with an electric current. The idea was that the person would eventually begin to associate same-sex attraction with pain and would therefore be turned off. I don't know if the idea was to turn them straight or just turn them off the same sex. But the committee never called him before them. He never got a chance to show this to the government, probably luckily. When Levin joined the SADF, he was immediately given the rank of colonel because of his psychiatrist licence. In 1971, he became a team leader in the drug rehabilitation programme at Ward 22 of one military hospital, and eventually he just became a Ward 22 leader overall. And Ward 22 was infamous as being the place they threw the soldiers who suffered psychotic breakdowns, something which happens quite often at war in the military for quite obvious reasons. Or at least that was the rumour within the military. If you had a breakdown, you were going to Ward 22. In reality, most people in Ward 22 had never seen any form of combat. Instead, a large percentage of people on Ward 22 were just conscientious objectors, drug users, homosexuals, or just otherwise deviant from the standard SADF expectations. Army psychologists would just label these people as disturbed and have them shipped off to the wards. Gay people were grouped in with people with severe mental illness. They were all treated the same, which was just awful. The treatment at this ward was horrendous. As you can probably guess, this is where the Aversion project came to fruition, based on an idea that Levin had been pondering for many, many years now. Now, something that's probably also important to know is that whilst Levin clearly didn't like gay people, he also had a hatred for drugs, particularly against the use of marijuana. His doctoral thesis in university was a damning analysis of the use of marijuana by white men in the SADF. Any conscript found taking drugs would also be marched off towards 22. I suppose the more important context here, just an interesting piece of information, is a fascinating relationship between the SADF and the SAMS, the South African Medical Services. Health professionals in the SAMS were drawn from both the permanent force as well as through conscription. So doctors, nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, they could be conscripted. And medical personnel in the army in the SAMS could not disobey a lawful command from a higher up in the military, which made for a very great potential of contradiction between medical ethics and the military. What did health workers follow? Did they follow the moral codes under which they stood as professionals, as doctors, as nurses? Or did they follow the instructions coming from higher ups in the military? There was no sort of body governing this. There was nobody making sure that everything was ethical and in check. You just kind of had to do what the military told you to do. According to the aforementioned research paper on the Aversion project, various reports attest that in this time the SADF respected none of the official documents or treaties regarding the medical treatment of human beings, nor the ethics of medical personnel. The SADF didn't think their doctors were subject to the Hippocratic Oath, nor the Tokyo Declaration, which banned doctors from participating in any form of torture. But doctors here in Ward 22 certainly took part in torture. It was whilst at Ward 22 that Levin truly developed his electroshock treatment and put it into action for the very first time. Upon arriving at the ward, patients would be stripped of their clothes and put in brown pyjamas. Every patient was put on Valium, and ward orderlies carried pistols that they could use if somebody tried to escape. This wasn't a hospital ward, it was a prison. Starting around 1971, some of the gay conscripts at Ward 22 would be subject to aversion therapy by electric shock. Exposure to black and white pictures of naked men whilst receiving shocks, and then viewing Playboy magazine centerfolds of women whilst not receiving electric shocks. Electrodes be strapped to the upper arm with wires running to a dial calibrated from 1 to 10. The dial would gradually be turned up until the patient could take no more. The shock was said to be so intense there's reports in one case of the subject's shoes flying off a lesbian woman. And I just want to take a moment here to talk about a personal story, something that happened to me a couple of days ago, which really sort of drilled into me how awful this electroshock therapy must have been. So I have horses. I promise this is going to be relevant. I have horses, and to keep the horses in the paddocks where they're supposed to be, you use electric fencing, or at least we do at my yard and a lot of other people do. And it's basically electric fencing, like thin little electric tape that is powered by usually a car battery, and it just basically stops, I think I said battery really weird then, it basically stops the horses from getting out their paddocks. It gives them like a little shock. It's not awful, but it's just like a little shock, and it'll also shock you, the human, if you touch it. And the other day I went down to the field in my Crocs in this weather in the UK. If anyone's in the UK, you know how rainy and horrible it's been. Going down in my Crocs, I don't know what I was thinking. Got down there, my entire Croc was just filled with mud. So I leaned into my horse's field through the electric tape to just clean off my Croc in the water trough. And as I did so, my head touched the electric tape. And I think we must have just put a new car battery or something on it, because this electric shock on my head was so intense that I literally blacked out for a second. All I remember is 1 second leaning through to put my Croc in the water trough to clean it off. And then the next second I was stood 2 meters away, shaking intensely with a pulsing on my head just here. I can still feel it. I can still feel where I got this electric shock. And I blacked out and I was shaking. I felt sick. I couldn't move. It was awful. And that was just from one quick, I must have been touching it for less than a second. It was so quick, and the pain was so intense. The effect it had on my whole body was so intense. And all I could think in that moment after writing this and researching this topic over the last couple of weeks is how awful this electric shock therapy must have been for the people who were enduring it, because they were going through a lot more than accidentally touching a bit of electric tape with their head. Anyway, after that point, I went and adjusted the sort of settings on the battery on the thing so my horse wouldn't receive quite a severe shock if he touched it. They generally don't touch the tape. It's not like they're getting shocked all the time. I know there's going to be people mad at me. It's just to keep them safe, just keep them where they should be so they're not running down the road. But yeah, it was bad, and I just wanted to cry in that moment, because all I could think is these people went through 100 times worse than I went through in that moment, and I literally blacked out for a second. I don't remember how I got from the water trough to standing 2 meters away. I don't remember. Michael Smith spoke to Chris McGreal for The Guardian in 2000, saying that he was an 18-year-old conscript when he was forced to admit that he was homosexual in front of his parents by Dr. Levin, and this was the first time his parents realised that he was gay, and they were horrified. Levin told them about therapy he had that would reorientate him, so the parents and him agreed to the treatment, being sent to Ward 22. Michael said, when you reach the maximum point and you say, no, I can't take any more, he, Levin, would say, now you must think about your girlfriend. I was actually just completely freaked out and confused. It certainly didn't do much for my impulse of attraction for other boys. Whilst in the many years since all this, Levin has denied that the Aversion project ever took place, he has admitted to using narcoanalysis, or a truth drug, the slow injection of a barbiturate, before questioning. He said, narcoanalysis was used, I give you that, but it was used in very isolated cases and only to help treat post-traumatic stress. Narcoanalysis was used to help get victims to talk about the trauma they suffered. Former patients, though, gays and drug addicts, say very different. They were continually subjected to the barbiturates to see if they were really cured or not. Drug users who were considered habitual addicts would eventually be sent to a hard labour farm. In 1970, Levin had personally overseen the building of a place called Greifswald, a farm just outside of Limpopo. The farm was another experiment of sorts, in which many men were subjected to forced labour and physical torture in a bid to peel them like an onion. Those who were not cured of their deviance would be sent to Greifswald. It was basically just a harsher version of military training. You'd march for hours through bush, building barracks, shooting wildlife, deprived of food and sleep. It was psychological torture. These men weren't allowed any contact with their families, who very much believed they were still being treated at Ward 22, and even then they had no idea of the real treatment there. This was a favourite for the drug addicts and other deviants. Levin never quite wanted to give up on the electroshock therapy for the gay people. However, eventually Levin was forced to conclude that his aversion therapy just didn't work. Of course, it didn't work. But instead of giving up, he turns to other methods instead. He turned to forcibly conducting sex change operations. Whilst most females, most lesbians, had been generally spared from the shock treatment, they were very much forced through the sex change procedures. I mean, this is almost unthinkable in today's world, isn't it? Where transgender people are being villainised and othered for the pure fact of being transgender. As the queer community so often are, they're used now as scapegoats by governments to detract from their failures. Don't look at all the terrible things we're doing. Look at trans people, look at drag queens, blame them. The idea of governments forcing sex changes is entirely foreign now, but at this point, Levin considered it the only obvious solution to homosexuality. According to the aforementioned report, possibly 900 sex change operations were carried out under the auspices of the SADF. That's a rate of about 50 operations a year for 18 years. Once the operations were completed, the subjects would be discharged from military service, given new identity papers and told never to contact their loved ones again. For some, they were discharged before the sex change was even complete, leaving them in this weird limbo with no one to turn to, nowhere to go. These people were mutilated, most likely without consent, or if they did consent, it was after a long period of torture, both physical and psychological. Many people were forced to now rely on hormone treatments for the rest of their lives at their own expense. There was no counselling, no follow-up, no help provided. And conscription started at 17. Some of the people who were subject to this may not have even been adults yet. One very well documented account, one very well documented victim is Jean Erasmus, who was chemically castrated by Levin in 1980, and he sadly took his own life in 1999 after dealing with the after effects of what he went through for years, but not before carefully documented the maltreatment he suffered at the hands of Levin. The things that he claimed were beyond what we've even covered today. As part of his treatment for homosexuality, he was apparently forced to participate in the gang rape of Angolan women. He was forced to take hormone drugs to fix him, although he never knew what these drugs were, and that was before he was eventually castrated. As a result of all this, he suffered severe depression. And this wasn't even the sex change, this was just castration. A report into Jean's case writes, as a result of the research process, Neil has touched the core of his anger and humiliation. At this point, he was anonymously referred to as Neil to protect his identity. He decided to explore litigation. Assisted by a psychiatrist, psychologist, an internist, and a human rights lawyer, they tried to find out exactly what treatment was given. He was given no information at the time of treatment, and it appears that all records of his treatment have been destroyed. The doctor who treated him pleaded amnesia, so without evidence, the case could not proceed. What are the possibilities of other compassionate doctors trying to reverse the treatment when no records were kept? Speaking in the year 2000 to the Mail and Guardian, Levin said, "Nobody was given electric shock treatment by me. We did not practice Russian communist-style torture. What we practiced was aversion therapy. We caused slight, very slight discomfort in the arm by contracting the muscles using an electronic device. Some people used elastic bands to shock patients. Nobody was hurt and nobody was ever held against their will. At no time were patients forced to submit to treatment." But of course, he would say that. He also denied gender reassignment surgery, saying that no such operations were performed by the military, and the political atmosphere at the time meant that such surgery was just simply not tolerated or even considered. He said, "We did not keep human guinea pigs like Russian communists. We only had patients who wanted to be cured and were there voluntarily." But the people in Ward 22, multiple people who have come forward, have very much said otherwise. And to this day, there are many people who haven't come forward. There are so many stories we haven't and never will hear because they're ashamed. People who are probably still in the closet hiding this part of themselves, told repeatedly it was shameful to be gay. Whilst aversion therapy never would have turned people straight, it sure would have terrified people into keeping their sexualities a secret. Levin left the military in 1975, but his legacy very much continued. From 75 to 81, he worked at Addington Hospital in Durban and Fort England Psychiatric Hospital in Grahamstown, now Mackanda. It's very much documented that he would perform chemical castrations in those hospitals. And then in 1995, he very abruptly moved to Canada, where he acquired a license to continue practicing medicine. He ended up becoming a professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of Calgary. But why did he move? Well, Levin heard that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the restorative justice body assembled by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, amongst others, had named him. At the end of apartheid, they were inviting witnesses who'd been identified as victims of gross human rights violations to come forward and give statements about their experiences. Levin apparently heard this and left in such a hurry that he didn't even pack his office. His belongings had to be sent via post to Canada, where he very quickly emigrated. He said that his only reason for leaving was the high crime rate in South Africa, and has of course denied all accusations against him. That same year, he'd get his license to practice medicine in Saskatchewan in Canada. When in the late 1990s the TRC requested that he testify in South Africa to respond to the many claims against him, he threatened legal action and refused to appear. The final TRC report did not identify him by name in the end. He was simply referred to as a psychologist who practiced aversion therapy. Basically, with the end of apartheid and people actually looking into human rights violations, Levin realised that he was going to get in trouble and he needed to leave the country stat. But with leaving South Africa, his crimes didn't end. In March 2010, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta suspended his license over accusations of abuse after a male patient filmed him making sexual advances on him. By July 2010, 30 other men had come forward claiming they were assaulted during counselling sessions. Yes, you heard that right. Aubrey Levin seemed to like men himself in whatever capacity that was. I've been told off in the past for saying in videos, often a huge reason behind homophobia is latent homosexuality, people being scared of their own feelings, not knowing how to put that into action, and so they just become homophobic. It's not the only reason, it's not every homophobic person, of course, but it very often can be a reason behind this apparent fear of homosexuality. I wonder if Levin ever subjected himself to his aversion therapy. Take bets and say that he probably didn't. I mean, you see this a lot with very anti-gay politicians who are eventually outed as gay. A lot of the time it stems from authoritarian, homophobic parents who push their beliefs on their kids. A lot of the time these people don't even realise they're gay themselves, but if you are feeling that kind of visceral reaction to gay people, ask yourself why that is. Why do you feel such intense emotions over a group that apparently doesn't affect you in any way? Research published in the April 2012 issue of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology looks into this much deeper. Of course, again, this is only one reason, it's not the only reason, but it's fascinating nonetheless. As the co-author of the research, Richard Ryan, said to Scientific American in 2012, sometimes people are threatened by gays and lesbians because they are fearing their own impulses. In a sense, they doth protest too much. In addition, it appears that sometimes those who would oppress others have been oppressed themselves, and we can have some compassion for them too. They may be unaccepting of others because they cannot be accepting of themselves. In a lot of cases, I may agree with the statement of compassion, however hard that may be, but I do not believe that is applicable in the case of Aubrey Levin. I don't believe that for a second. Not only did he commit these human rights violations back in South Africa, but in 2013 he was found guilty of 3 charges of sexual assault against male patients between 2008 and 2010. He was found not guilty of 2 others, and there was a mistrial declared in a further 4 counts, but he was found guilty on 3 of them. Apparently, Canada was unaware of Levin's history, despite in 1998 the Health and Human Rights Project sent a letter to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta warning them of his background. It was that same year he was given a licence to practice medicine in Alberta. Were they unaware, or did they just not care? How did they miss this? Despite being given a 5-year prison sentence, Levin was actually released on bail on 13th of February 2013, very soon after his trial. Apparently, since his licence to practice medicine had been suspended, he was no longer a danger to the public. In 2014, though, the Court of Appeal upheld the 2013 conviction, and he was ordered to report to begin his sentence. In 2016, he was granted day parole and was living in a halfway house. He requested a full pardon, saying that his victims lied and had in for him. A psychological evaluation said that he had very little care for his victims. He was manipulative and saw himself as the victim. He denied any sexual motive for the offences and said that he was not aware that what he was doing was a criminal act because it was allowed in South Africa. In 1995, the South African Medical Associate did issue a public apology for past wrongdoings, but honestly, not much has been said since then in regards to Levin's treatment of people in Ward 22. Eventually, the Aversion Research Project was formed, a team of academic researchers and activists who wanted to do a deep dive into what had really happened with the Aversion Project. It was more of a look at homosexuality in the military at the time, the context around it. It's been a fantastic source throughout this video, and I do highly recommend you read it if you want to. It features first-hand accounts of people who experienced this. I'll leave it linked down below in my sources. According to Wikipedia, the team came against a lot of obstacles whilst trying to create this paper. They had to be approved by a research committee, however the committee took issue with the use of the word abuse as a way of describing what happened. They thought that considering the conversion therapy as abuse was only an assumption. Electroshock therapy was so intense that people begged for it to end, people's shoes flew off. Apparently not abuse. I would personally argue that all conversion therapy is abuse. Research by the American Psychological Association in 2007 showed clear evidence that conversion therapy of any kind does not work, and some significant evidence that it is also harmful to LGBTQ+ people. As an LGBTQ+ person, I can back this up. But back to the paper, the research committee did also not agree with the researchers' designation of this being a human rights violation, which did just raise some questions generally, because it became very clear that the research committee did not want this to be an investigation into the practices of medical officials involved in the military. Basically, the only proper research project into the Aversion project was muted at points by the higher committee, because I can only assume they were scared of what was going to be found, of what could be put out there. So to this day, 2023, we still don't really have the full story. In conclusion here, Levin's hypothesis was found false. He never cured anyone of homosexuality. He just left them psychologically damaged or physically in some cases. There is a support group today for surviving participants, and some are still seeking government help, especially for medical care on the back of the botched gender reassignment surgeries. Under the Nuremberg Code, which has been in place since 1947, a set of ethical principles for human experimentation, this never ever should have happened. The code hasn't been officially accepted as law by any nation or any association, but generally the Nuremberg Code is just a good set of ethical rules to follow when you're doing experiments. The code is considered to be the most important document in the history of clinical research ethics. It has this massive influence on global human rights. If you're following the Nuremberg Code, the Aversion project was wrong, pure and simple. Just a few ways in which the Aversion project went against the code. There was no voluntary consent, it didn't avoid unnecessary physical or psychological suffering, it didn't avoid research where death or injury is likely. The research wasn't only conducted by highly qualified researchers, and it wasn't for the good of society. There were no options for participants here to withdraw. They were held at Ward 22 against their will. They were stripped of clothes and belongings. They didn't expect to be electric shocked or to receive barbiturates or sex changes. They didn't know what they were consenting to if they did consent. Levin today is still alive. He never went back to South Africa to answer his crimes. He remains in Canada. And that's kind of it. There's no justice here. There's no happy ending to this story, if there ever could be. It is just pure violation of people's human rights and no justice. And it just makes me so angry. No form of conversion therapy is ever going to work. Electroshock therapy isn't going to turn people straight. People don't need to be turned straight. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you feel like you've learned something new, even if it is a very heavy topic. And I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys.